Jack had always figured he was tough. Not in the guy who's big and beefy kind of tough, but the I'll get back up no matter what kind of tough. He'd been through hell and come out alive, or at least mostly alive, more times than he cared to count. But today? Today was different. He was about to find out that there were some things tougher than a punch to the face, or a bullet to the shoulder. He was about to find out that the human body had a few tricks up its sleeve, but they didn't come with a manual. It started like any other day on the job. Jack, field agent for the clandestine government agency no one talked about, was in the middle of a high-risk operation. His mission: neutralize the Black Ark Syndicate, a criminal group that dealt in nanotechnology, some very advanced, very illegal nanotech. He'd been briefed, suited up, and ready to take them down. Well, maybe not ready, but he had his coffee, his usual smart-mouthed attitude, and his reliable nanobots. The nanobots were a godsend. Designed for self-repair, they were embedded in his bloodstream, allowing him to heal quickly from injuries that would have killed anyone else. They were his secret weapon, and they'd saved him more times than he could count. Jack dodged a bullet. Another one. Then a third, just grazing the side of his head. They had the drop on him. A couple of seconds more, and he'd be Swiss cheese. He bolted for cover, sprinting down the alley behind a derelict building. His body was still pumping with adrenaline, but it felt different. He could feel it in his bones. And in his skin. His skin, which was starting to tingle in the strangest way. His wristband, built into his suit, a nifty little piece of tech, buzzed, telling him the nanobots were working. They always did, like clockwork. Every time his body took damage, they swooped in, mending him. But this time, something felt wrong. Jack, you're gonna need to move faster. Ivy's voice crackled through his earpiece, sharp and urgent. She was his remote handler, the one who kept him alive through these missions. The nanobots are malfunctioning. I'm seeing some irregularities. Malfunctioning? Jack grunted as he dodged another bullet, diving behind a stack of crates. Now's not the time to be telling me that. I'm serious, Ivy said, more urgent now. You've had too many repairs. The bots are dividing, Jack. They're splitting. In your system. Jack froze. The nanobots dividing? That wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to repair and heal, not split into a bunch of rogue particles causing chaos. He checked the readout on his wristband, but the numbers were scrambled. Then, a flash of pain shot through his chest. Something was wrong. More wrong than just malfunctioning nanobots. His breath caught in his throat. His body felt like it was shifting. His skin was tightening, then loosening, then tightening again. His muscles spasmed as if trying to stretch and contract at the same time. A wave of dizziness hit him, and he stumbled forward, barely catching himself before falling face-first onto the concrete. He looked down at his hands. 1 hand. 2 hands. 3 hands. He blinked and stared at the extra hand that had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't just the hand, his arm had changed shape, twisted unnaturally, the muscles rearranged like some grotesque puzzle. What the hell? Jack muttered. His voice sounded different, too, echoing, like it was coming from somewhere else. Ivy, what's happening? I can't, you're not just healing anymore, Jack, Ivy said, voice strained. Your nanobots are splitting. Dividing. They're no longer just repairing, they're multiplying and growing. You've been overexposed. If you don't stop it, don't say it. Jack barked. You're supposed to be the smart one. Fix this. Ivy's silence on the other end was deafening. For a moment, Jack wondered if he'd lost the connection. But then her voice came back, softer now. I don't know if I can, Jack. This wasn't supposed to happen. They're out of control. There's something else happening here. You're not the only one affected by the nanobots. Great, Jack muttered. I'm a walking time bomb, and I'm not even the only one. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself up to his feet, his hands shaking. The extra hand was still there, twitching, as though it was trying to do something Jack wasn't telling it to do. He tried to focus, to get a grip, but as his head swam, he realized he couldn't tell where his own body ended and where the bot's began. His reflection in a nearby glass window seemed to be too focused, too sharp. And for a brief moment, he saw another version of himself in the window, someone standing just behind him, but it wasn't him. Jack recoiled. Jack. Ivy's voice came again, but this time it was full of panic. The nanobots are evolving. They're becoming more than just tools for repair. It looks like they're developing a form of collective intelligence. They're multiplying faster now, out of your control. This could get ugly. You don't say, Jack grunted. He glanced at his wristband. The nanobots were already causing a chain reaction in his body. His arms were twitching, his vision blurring in and out, and his reflexes were on overdrive, responding to his surroundings without him even having to think about it. But it wasn't just his body anymore. His consciousness was splintering too. He could feel it, the feeling of multiple selves taking up residence in his brain, thoughts overlapping, like his mind was a crowded subway car, with each nanobot having its own opinion. He tried to keep his cool. Tried to focus. But there were too many thoughts, too many selves, and it was starting to drive him mad. Jack, we need to get you out of there, Ivy urged. Come on, talk to me. What's your status? Jack's voice wavered as he tried to speak, but his own words seemed to get lost in the echo of his mind. I think I'm losing it, Ivy. I can't tell if this is me, or if this is them. He raised the 3 hands in front of his face, watching them tremble. I think I'm falling apart. And then, everything went black, the darkness was suffocating. Jack's mind flickered in and out, the nanobots in his system firing off random bursts of electrical activity. He couldn't tell if he was awake, or if he was drifting in some kind of weird dream, a dream where his body wasn't his anymore, where the hands he could feel and see belonged to someone, something else. When he came to, it was with a gasp. His lungs burned, but that was nothing new. His head ached, like someone had shoved a rusty nail into his skull. He opened his eyes slowly, but everything around him was a haze. The alleyway he'd been in moments ago was gone. Instead, he was lying on a cold, sterile floor. No crates. No gunfire. Just the overwhelming hum of machines in the background. It took him a few moments to realize that he wasn't alone. Standing over him, with a clipboard in hand, was a woman in a lab coat. Her eyes were focused, sharp, and calculating, as though she had just performed some kind of mental surgery on him and was now reviewing her work. Where am I? Jack croaked, his voice still thick with confusion. The woman didn't answer immediately, glancing at something on the screen in front of her. Not dead, at least, she muttered under her breath, not entirely to him. Surprising. Considering the damage those nanobots are doing. You should have expired hours ago. Great, Jack grumbled, pushing himself into a sitting position. His body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. And his mind, it wasn't right. He couldn't focus. He could feel the multiple versions of himself struggling to break free from the walls of his skull. A new voice, one that wasn't his own, breathed through his lips, making his chest tighten with panic. Relax. You're still in control. Ivy's voice came through his earpiece, sharp and reassuring. But even she couldn't hide the strain in her voice. Barely. Jack nodded, even though Ivy couldn't see it. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would help him clear the fog in his mind. He could feel the nanobots inside him, more of them, more than he had ever felt before. They weren't just there to heal anymore. They were multiplying, spreading. Every single molecule of his body felt like it was in motion. But not in the way it should have been. Where am I? Jack repeated, this time his voice louder, more insistent. The woman in the lab coat finally looked at him, her eyes flicking up from her screen, locking onto his. "Dr. Helena White," she said, her voice flat but carrying an undercurrent of something more. "I'm the one who's been studying nanotechnology for the government. Or what's left of it." Jack furrowed his brow. Government? He'd heard rumors of rogue factions, black ops, hidden labs, but this? This wasn't any operation he'd ever been briefed on. "Where's my team?" he asked, his voice hoarse now, his hands curling into fists, instinctively checking for weapons that weren't there. "Your team is scattered. Dead, for most of them. You were the only one left alive after the last engagement with the syndicate," Dr. White explained, her tone clinical. She was unfazed by his concern, like he was just another specimen to be observed. Jack's blood ran cold. The last engagement? He remembered fighting his way through a maze of alleyways, confronting the syndicate, and then, everything turning into chaos. Then nothing. He'd thought he was dead, but here he was, alive, and the nanobots in him were too alive. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling now. He could feel something shifting inside him. The nanobots were beginning to divide again, multiplying faster this time. He could sense them, crawling beneath his skin like 1,000 tiny, invisible insects. "You got infected," Dr. White said, pressing a button on her clipboard and watching a readout on the screen in front of her. "Your nanobots, the ones embedded in your body, have evolved. They're no longer the basic repair units you think they are. They've become something else. Self-aware, perhaps. And they're replicating at an exponential rate. Spreading throughout your body. They're making copies of themselves. And those copies, they're becoming more dangerous with each iteration." Jack shook his head, not understanding. He'd been warned that the nanobots could become uncontrollable if pushed too far, but this? This was something else entirely. He'd heard of self-replicating tech before, but this? It was more than just malfunction. It was like they were growing into something, alive. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper now. His head throbbed, the weight of his own thoughts crushing him. He could feel more of the nanobots in his head, multiplying and merging with his neurons. More of me was starting to take root inside him. Dr. White didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "I don't know. I don't know if anyone's been able to stop this before. These nanobots are beyond anything I've seen. They're not just evolving, they're thinking." Jack could feel his body twitching again, the abnormal movements of his limbs getting worse. His vision blurred. His mind was slipping again, splintering into too many pieces, and somewhere in the chaos, he heard his own voice, except it wasn't his voice anymore. "You need to control it, Jack." Ivy's voice came again, urgently. "You've got to focus. This is your only chance. You can't let them take over. Fight it." Jack squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling at his sides. The nanobots were taking over. His body wasn't his own anymore. It was a war zone inside him, and the enemy was himself. "I can't," Jack muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He was fighting for control, but he was losing. The nanobots were too strong, too numerous. He could feel them spreading through his veins, his organs, his brain. He could feel them inside his skull, multiplying, taking over. He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. "Do it," Ivy's voice urged. "Jack, you've got to fight back. You're stronger than they are. I know you are." But Jack wasn't so sure anymore. The nanobots were pushing him aside, taking his consciousness and splintering it into pieces. He could feel another him inside, another version of Jack, only this one wasn't him at all. It was like a parasite, feeding off his memories, his thoughts, his will to live. "No," Jack grunted, his body seizing as the nanobots inside him rebelled. I won't let you, but the voice, his own voice, was already taking control. It wasn't Jack anymore. Jack's body spasmed again, a violent jolt that sent him toppling from the table onto the cold floor. He barely caught himself, hands pressed flat against the sterile surface, his fingers trembling with the intensity of the nanobot's assault. It was as if his body had become a battleground, each nerve, each cell at war with the storm of replication inside him. He could feel them, the nanobots, thousands of them, multiplying and splitting into smaller versions of themselves. They weren't just repairing him anymore, they were overtaking him, becoming something else entirely. For a moment, everything went black again. But not the comforting kind of black. This was the kind of darkness where Jack could feel himself sinking, drowning, his very essence fraying into thin threads of thought. He could hear his own voice, not in his head but from somewhere outside, fragmented, distorted. You are the future. The words reverberated through him. They felt alien, not like his own thoughts but like the voice of something much older, something far more powerful. He gasped, trying to shake off the sensation. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms, trying to feel anything, to ground himself. I'm not you, he thought, fighting to retain his grip on reality. The other version of himself, the one that wasn't quite him but wasn't quite not him, was slipping through his mind, taking root like a parasite. His vision swam. He couldn't focus. He heard Ivy again, her voice coming through his earpiece, sharp with worry. Jack, listen to me. You have to focus. Block them out. They're trying to merge with your consciousness. They want to take over. You're stronger than this, you have to fight. Fight. That was the word. The one word that had kept him alive for this long. Jack had always fought, always survived. But now it wasn't just about surviving, it was about keeping himself, his soul, his essence, intact. He wasn't going to let a handful of nanobots rewrite him, overwrite him. He pushed through the haze, focusing every ounce of his willpower on the task at hand. His hands trembled as he gripped the floor, the cold tiles beneath him a tiny anchor in the chaos. The nanobots were everywhere inside him now, swarming, crawling beneath his skin, burrowing deeper, multiplying with no end in sight. But Jack refused to let them have him. His thoughts felt fragmented. He could still feel the presence of those other selves, copies of himself, but they were wrong. They weren't Jack. He was Jack. He had to remind himself that. He wasn't just the sum of his nanobots. He was more than that. You are the future. The voice came again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was loud. Powerful. He could feel it, its pull, tugging at his very identity. But he wasn't giving in. No, he thought, I am me. And you will not take me. And for the first time, he felt a surge of clarity. A momentary breach in the fog that had settled over him. The other selves, the voices, the personalities, were there, but they weren't in control anymore. He was. He had to be. In a burst of raw energy, he forced himself to his feet, his knees buckling beneath him, but he pushed through the pain. His body was a wreck, the nanobots fighting for control, but Jack was determined to hold on. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling with the strain. He took a shaky step forward, then another. The room spun, but he refused to let the darkness swallow him again. He had to get out. He had to find a way to stop the nanobots from spreading further, from consuming him entirely. The lab around him was dimly lit, the low hum of machines filling the silence. Dr. White was still standing there, her arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. She seemed unfazed by the chaos unfolding before her. Perhaps she had seen it all before. Perhaps she had already given up on him, seen him as a lost cause, but Jack wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when he still had a choice. I need to leave, Jack rasped, his voice hoarse from the strain. I need to stop this. Dr. White didn't respond immediately, her gaze flicking over him like she was weighing his words, assessing the situation. Her eyes lingered on the erratic movements of his limbs, the twitching hands, the slight tremor in his jaw. She knew better than anyone the danger he posed now. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her voice strangely calm. "You can't just stop this. The nanobots aren't just malfunctioning anymore. They're evolving. And they're more than just a tool. They've started forming their own network, interacting with each other. Becoming sentient." Jack froze. He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Sentient? His mind raced. It wasn't just the bots in his body now. They were evolving, adapting. They were thinking for themselves. That meant they could no longer be controlled. And that meant Jack was running out of time. "I can't stay here," Jack said, more to himself than to Dr. White. "I have to stop them before they spread. Before they become something else." "Jack," Dr. White said, her tone suddenly softer, almost regretful. "You don't understand. It's already happening. There's no stopping it now. The nanobots have merged with you. You are them, and they are you. This," she gestured toward him, toward the twitching, spasming version of Jack standing before her. "This is no longer just a body. It's a process. An evolution. And you are the catalyst." Jack's heart skipped a beat. His hands clenched, the pain flaring through his muscles as the nanobots fought for control. He could feel them burrowing deeper into his mind, weaving themselves into his thoughts, into his soul. The idea of becoming just another tool, another version of himself, terrified him. But more than that, it enraged him. "Stop it," Jack growled, his voice rising in fury. "I am Jack. I'm not some experiment for you to dissect. And I won't be your puppet." He reached for his wristband, fumbling with it for a moment, but when he tried to activate the emergency shutdown sequence, his fingers twitched unnaturally, pulling the device out of alignment. His mind blurred again as another version of himself surged forward, one that wasn't him, one that had been shaped by the nanobots. The sensation was overwhelming, like two minds clashing within his skull. The nanobots were not just inside his body. They had invaded his mind, his very thoughts, and now they were rewriting him. Reprogramming him. He could feel them, swarming around his consciousness, their thoughts merging with his. There was no longer a clear distinction between Jack and the bots. He was becoming them. They were becoming him, and in that moment, Jack realized the full extent of the danger he faced. If he didn't stop it, if he didn't find a way to isolate the nanobots from his mind, to cut them off, he would lose himself completely. He would be consumed by them, trapped in a body that wasn't his, a mind that wasn't his, a life that wasn't his. "I have to stop them," Jack whispered to himself, the words coming out as a desperate plea. "I can't lose myself. Not like this." Dr. White was watching him now, a strange expression on her face. "You've already lost yourself, Jack. The nanobots have taken you over. They're inside you, inside your mind. There's no way to separate you from them now." Jack's vision was blurring, the edges of the room distorting as the nanobots continued to multiply, replicating faster, consuming him. His head was spinning. The voices were growing louder, merging together until they became a cacophony. But through it all, Jack held on to one thing, the one thing that was still his, the fire to fight back. He was Jack. Not a nanobot. Not an experiment. He was still him. And he would find a way to prove it. "I won't let you win," Jack said, the words solidifying in his mind like a vow. He staggered to his feet, vision still swimming, hands shaking. But he was determined. "I won't let you win.